All right, guys, big news coming out about the US economy on something that you might not see covered in the news. In April, the US trade deficit dropped sharply to 61.6 billion. This is down from a record number of 138 billion just 1 month prior. So this is a pretty big shift. This is a massive shift. The question is, what caused it? Simply put, imports fell by 16%, while exports increased modestly, just a little bit by 3%. But this was enough to dramatically change how the numbers played out for us on the import-export trade imbalance. Of the reduced imports, the majority, the biggest impact were from China. No surprise there. And we saw these most pronounced in machinery and consumer goods. But biggest note here on China specifically is that imports from China are at a 5-year low. So, is this good or bad for the China discussion? Well, if you're the Trump administration, who's very clear that they want to reduce reliance on Chinese goods, this is considered a big win. At the same time, we're seeing US exports increased to almost 290 billion. This is big, and it was big enough to shift the balances where multiple countries we are now a net exporter to. These included countries like Australia, Switzerland, Spain, and others. So what we're starting to see is the tariffs, or even the tariff discussions and threats, are now shifting the dynamic to the point where the US is now a net exporter to multiple countries. This could and likely will continue in the future to reduce the trade imbalance overall by a pretty big amount. So what caused this massive swing that we saw last month? Much of it came from companies trying to beat the new tariffs. They knew that Liberation Day was coming. They knew that tariffs would be implemented at that time and that goods would get much more expensive, both to import and export. So a lot of countries made big moves in that period of time to avoid the more expensive prices. A big note here, with those import exports spiking in dramatic fashion, what we're seeing is the reality that many experts believe this is not going to be steady. We're not going to see these numbers for a consistent period moving forward. That makes sense though, and that's fair for experts to think that, because the reality is, with all the shifting back and forth of policy changes, we're going live with tariffs, we're delaying them for a period of time. This is a lot for countries, for companies, and for consumers to adjust to. So what we don't know is how this will all land over the long-term basis. But what we do know is that this is moving the needle in the direction that the Trump administration is pushing for, which is to reduce the deficit overall. So here's the big question. Is a trade deficit even a win? Well, the answer is it really depends on who you ask. For instance, the Trump administration is extremely vocal about the fact that they see a reduced trade deficit as a huge priority for that administration. Why? Because our reliance on other countries and their goods is reduced in their opinion. They also see that manufacturing being back in the US boosts jobs, boost opportunities here on shore, so that US dollars are going to US manufacturers and US companies. The counter argument that you'll hear from some economists is that it's not necessarily a bad thing to have a trade deficit. Why? Because that makes a stronger US dollar often, which means that goods and services from other countries being brought in are actually realized at a cheaper price by US consumers. They'll argue that a stronger dollar is often the result of a trade deficit like we have now, which means goods and services brought into the US are cheaper, and US consumers experience a cheaper cost of living by those imports alone. Many would even argue that a trade deficit like we have actually gives more faith in the US, gives more faith in the US dollar, and actually increases a lot of investment into things like treasury bills and other investments that are government backed by the US government itself. The net result out of all of this is that we still have a lot of uncertainty. And what that's led to is small businesses in particular having a pretty negative outlook in the future. This is because small businesses are more susceptible to changes in prices. They don't have that huge chunk of cash that many of the big corporations are sitting on that can weather the storm more easily. So The big net here, the bottom line here, is that the deficit drop looks great on paper. And if you're the Trump administration, you're celebrating a big win by these numbers, but the future is a little more uncertain and will really depend on where we go from here.